welcome to another of our It's Time to ReWild Yourself video podcasts. This month's podcast, I should say, we are looking at the nature connection pathway of compassion, and I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic expert guests with me today, and I will let them introduce themselves in a second. But before we do, just a quick reminder, if this is the first one of these that you've seen, we are Voice for Nature, and this campaign that we're running, ReWild Yourself, is all about improving people's relationship with nature for their own well-being and for the well-being and the benefit of the planet. And we've run this campaign, It's Time to ReWild Yourself, which has been very much inspired by the University of Derby's 5 pathways to nature connection. And these are 5 ways that people can improve their relationship with nature. And I sometimes forget that. We're going to see if I can list them now. So we've got beauty, we've got contact, senses, we've got emotion, meaning, and compassion. And we've had 4 other of these podcasts already on the other pathways, and this is our 5th. This is about compassion. And we'll get into exactly what we mean by nature connection in a moment, but I'd like to introduce Hal Rhoades and Mark Stead to this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Hal, perhaps we can start with you. If you can just let us know who you are, where you are. It's always nice to know where people are. What you do and its connection as well to this idea of nature connection.
Yeah, thanks, David. Really nice to be here. My name's Hal, and I live in the Malvern Hills. So I'm actually not too far away from Mark, I don't think. A lovely part of the world, beautiful granite hill range. So very lucky to live life close to nature and get out there every day with the dog. And I work for an organisation called Action for Conservation, which is a charity which I'm sure we'll get more into, which is all about supporting teenagers in particular and young people to get involved in nature restoration, nature connection in various different ways. But prior to working, I'm now very much in the UK, but prior to doing this I was working more internationally in sub-Saharan Africa and the Arctic, mainly with local and indigenous communities who, in their own ways and through their own cultural lenses, enjoy a very close relationship with nature. So I learnt a lot from my previous work in that realm as well, which hopefully I have a bit of a chance to talk about today. So thank you for having me.
Fab. Thanks, Hal. I didn't realise. Wow. Yeah. No, I'd love to hear more about those experiences and what we can learn from them. Mark, yes, the same to you. So where are you, and explain what your sort of day job is and how again it's connected to nature connection.
Yeah, hiya David, thanks for inviting me on. I couldn't be any closer to you, Hal, actually, because I'm usually in the office down at Slimbridge, Gloucestershire, but I'm actually at home in Tewkesbury at the moment, so not very far from you at all.
Yeah.
So I'm Mark Stead, Head of Learning at WWT. WWT are the UK's largest wetland restoration charity. We work to create, restore, manage and promote wetlands both in the UK and across the world. I suppose how I stumbled into the nature connection pieces was right back when I first started at WWT as Head of Learning. I'd come from a formal learning background. My background as a primary school teacher. I was a primary school teacher for 11 years for my sins, so I finally escaped the classroom. And with that background, I'd always had the opinion that if we could just tell the children all the facts about nature, they'd come to love it and they'd want to protect it. But the more I got into this role, the more I realised I don't think that's true at all. And actually, it's that direct hands-on contact with nature and giving them that emotional connection to nature that's really important. So where we used to have children sat in a classroom learning from textbooks, now we're much more about let's get them outdoors into the actual environment we're talking about, having direct contact with those animals and those plants that we're talking about. And that's what's going to get them to really connect and to really love nature. And the first programme I got to develop at WWT was Generation Wild, and that's our nature connection programme for children in economically disadvantaged areas. Been running for 3 years now, and that's developed entirely around those 5 pathways to nature connection that you just mentioned. So all of the activities that children complete are tied to one, or in most cases more than one, of those pathways. Real passion for nature connection as opposed to just drilling children with facts.
Excellent. I was a bit slow off the mark there with the photo, but that's one of the wonderful photos that you do have. And yeah, it's a wonderful initiative, and I think you've learnt a lot from it as well, which maybe we can get into some of that. I was just curious to know, Hal, if you had a similar sort of reckoning or journey, if you like, in terms of how you think about the best way to engage people environmentally, and if it did start again from a more of a sort of academic perspective, or have you always sort of had this understanding about the value of connecting more emotionally?
I think my just personally, as opposed to professionally, I think I had a trajectory which is not uncommon, which is that as a young child I instinctively connected with nature, and getting muddy and going swimming and doing all these things. I grew up in Wiltshire, so relatively rurally, but I think in any case you can kind of make a mud kitchen anywhere, can't you? And then we see in the UK and research which by the same people that we're talking about today at the University of Derby, that there's that teenage dip, and I definitely like football and rugby and and friends and that falling away from it. But I think and maybe we'll come on to talk about it, I had strong characters in my life, my grandfather in particular, who acted as that guide to nature, and to just, I guess, role modelling how it was a timeless thing. He's an older man, obviously, but still finding ways to connect. So on a personal level, I would say that it's a fluctuating thing, and now I'm very much living a life where I'm trying to be in contact with nature as much as possible, and that's because that was role modelled for me. I think that was always a place I could come back to, even if there were times that I was more interested in other things, and that's okay. And then from a professional point of view, I think it's been a funny one, because working mostly internationally and with people who live lives very differently to our own, hunter-gatherer peoples or subsistence agriculturalists, fisher peoples. These aren't necessarily questions that would occur in the same context and be framed and discussed in the same way. So it's more a case of then coming back and working more in the UK, and actually seeing that we're significantly impoverished when it comes to that connection and proximity to nature, knowledge, and so on, and feeling like actually the best place to start is with younger people, and trying to build back that connection, but also to provide opportunities that connection isn't, it's not a weekend thing, and it's not a one-off thing. How do you build it into life and your whole life trajectory? And that's the work that we're doing now at Action for Conservation. I think that's the professional picture.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, it's funny one, isn't it? Because I flashed it up on the screen there, but the University of Derby sort of nature connectedness research group, and various other similar organisations, they shouldn't really have to exist. Like you say, it shouldn't be this separate thing that we need to study and to create frameworks for, because it's the very most natural thing, that should be within us, and that's sort of the idea of nature connection. So, but we sort of have to now create these frameworks to get back to where we are naturally. Yeah. Does anyone? I've just realised sometimes you can jump into these things, and we almost need to take a step back. Would anyone be brave enough to actually try and define what do we mean by nature connection? I will do it if I have to, but I thought I'd throw it out first.
For me, I suppose it's more than just spending time in nature. That's what's really important. Again, something that I've realised. So, you could be a runner, for example, a fell runner. You could go for a run in the hills. You could be out in nature for 3 hours. But if you've got your headphones in and your focus is actually on your running, as opposed to the environment you're actually running through, then that isn't nature connection, I don't think, in the true sense. Equally, you could spend just 5 minutes in nature. Could be part of your lunch break. You're having a really busy day. You just pop outside for 5 minutes, close your eyes and listen to the birds singing, and that can be quite a profound connection to nature.
Yeah.
So it's not the same as time spent in nature, it's really what do you do with that time, and are you really taking time to experience nature with the full range of senses as we talked about earlier. I think that to me is the difference between just spending time in nature and true nature connection.
Absolutely.
And then also developing those emotional connections. As I say, it's, to me, nature connection is all about the emotions. It's not so much about the science. It's not learning about it from a textbook. It's actually having that, as I say, that true hands-on direct contact with nature that's really important for me.
Yeah. I know again Dr. Carly Butler from the University of Dublin. They talk about the quality of moments in nature, not the actual minutes themselves. Does any of what Mark said resonate with you, Hal, or do you have a sort of slightly different sense?
No, absolutely. I think that all makes a lot of sense to me. I think, it's nature connectedness is when that wall that potentially we feel exists becomes what it is really, which is a see-through space which we can step into, and be disabused of the fantasy that we aren't part of nature. So it's perhaps a bit like authenticity, in the sense that once you start to think about it, it ceases to be authentic. So it's when you stop asking yourself the question, am I connected to nature, you're simply being in that place as part of it. I would say
it's also a very different thing, isn't it, to access to nature, because people talk a lot about lack of access to nature, and truly I don't think there are many people at all that don't have access to nature. It always makes me laugh because people talk about access to green space, and when I was a youngster I grew up on a council estate. If you'd have mapped local green space, you would have said I didn't have any local green space in my vicinity. But actually all of my early nature experiences were picking up slow worms and frogs and things on a disused industrial estate. There was a disused railway line, next to an industrial estate that we used to go to, and all of my nature experiences were there. But if you'd looked at a map where I lived, you'd have said, oh no, this person doesn't have any access to green space at all. So I think there's something about getting that message across to everyone that no matter where you live, you can live slap bang in the middle of a city, but you can still look up and look at the clouds, you can see a plant growing up through a crack in the pavement. Nature really is everywhere, so there's nobody that doesn't have any access to nature. It's just a case of enjoying that nature that you do have where you live.
But there is a problem, isn't there, in that, again, the studies have shown this. I think it's the worst is it the UK has got some of the worst levels of nature connectedness in Europe. So where has this problem occurred? Why are we seeing this disconnect? As you say, Mark, if actually there is green space never too far away, what's going on? Hal, any ideas on? Probably lots.
So many ideas. I think when I was doing a bit of prep for this, I kind of feel like there's multiple levels to all of it. There's kind of structural factors, there's collective cultural factors, there's individual factors, and that goes both in terms of diagnosing the problem, but also thinking about what the solutions are. You could go. Maybe I'll keep it to the individual level at the moment, because that's where Mark's kicked us off from. But I think, I don't think it's for lack of want for connection. I think that's a critical thing. Especially amongst young people who maybe that Mark and I are both working with. I think that it's the other, like a critical thing from the individual point of view is the other side of what Mark's saying, which is like perhaps not, if it's not physical access, then it's feeling invited to access spaces. That's one thing. Like, is the door open? And that could be like the physical privatization or enclosure of spaces you might otherwise be able to enjoy. But it's also like a mental barrier. Like, is it seen as a desirable thing to do and engage with? Do you know, if you haven't had the experiences that Mark and I maybe have been lucky to have, that is something that is going to benefit you, but also that, and critically, I think that you can gain a great deal of connection and well-being from altruistically helping nature, and kind of completing that circle of reciprocity. So I think there's a kind of there's a gulf of the imagination which needs to be bridged again, and
Yeah.
that's a cultural task and a task of storytelling. And ultimately, I think it doesn't have to be everybody that gets the opportunity, but there can be these moments of critical mass where you have enough people that know about the benefit that you then get, hopefully, a tumble back into this just being the norm. And
Yeah.
I think that's where we need to go.
It's really interesting what you said about access, because we developed the Generation Wild programme, as I say, specifically for families and children in economically disadvantaged areas. And really, the barrier wasn't that they didn't have those green spaces on their doorstep. The barrier was that they didn't feel those spaces were for them and they didn't feel welcome there. So a lot of these families felt that they'd be frowned upon if they didn't have all the latest clothing and all the latest equipment and things. They thought they'd look stupid if they didn't immediately know all the names of all the plants and the animals. They worried about taking their children to bird hides because the seasoned birders might not like the noise that they were making, for example. People from ethnically diverse communities felt like they might be seen as not being welcome in those spaces. So really it was more of, are these people made to feel welcome, and do they feel like this is something for them, rather than those environments not physically being open to them, which is what you were saying, wasn't it, Hal, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. This feels like a whole other podcast. I think, or probably a whole series. How do we create that cultural shift, and how do we create that? I like that idea of a sort of critical mass, a tipping point where it will almost become self-sustaining and natural again. Let's jump back to the positives again, if you like, and why bother? You know, like one of the reasons that I was really happy to have both of you today is the fact that you've sort of seen on the ground, you know, the magic, if you like, or why there's value. Now, we've seen from research, they talk about positive effects to your health, physiological, the changes that happen when we spend time in nature, more specifically when we feel connected to nature, you know, social improvements in people, how sort of socialized they are and how relaxed and stressed they are. Also increased pro-environmental behavior, more likely to sort of want to care for and change your behavior. But which is all great stuff. The research is wonderful. But for on the ground, what have you seen which sort of makes you feel like, yes, this is what we need. This is what humanity needs. We need this connection. Hal, I'll ask you first.
Sure. I think, I think you're right. And so much research is about finding scientifically robust language for things that we deeply know to be true already. So I think the things that I see on the ground, particularly working with, so our project, our sort of flagship project where I spend most of my time, is called the Pen Pond Project. It's a intergenerational nature restoration project, and we've engaged like 12-year-olds, but also 86-year-olds, and it's the joy they find in working on the land together, physically restoring habitats, and then seeing the positive benefits of that. My colleague Molly just sent me a camera trap image this morning of an otter crawling into a otter hole, which we all built together. So it's these like very tangible moments of joy, of change, and of a group of people involved in collective work, which I think that idea of a community being built around a demanding common task, I think there's a great deal of value in that, and it's really those. I mean, you're showing some images now. It's that kind of like collective action, collective joy and celebration that tells me we're on the right track, doing something that has inherent value for the young people, but also for the land and for the adults and older people who we work with. So, yeah, it's maybe that's a simple answer, but that's the kind of felt answer, I would say.
No, that's exactly what we were after. Yeah, it feels right, it feels good, and that intergenerational element I think is so important. Well, it's so interesting what's happening in Pen Pond. People can come and visit, can't they? Let us. Where is Pen Pond, Hal?
Yeah, so Pen Pond is about 5 miles outside of Brecon, up the River Usk in the Banau Breconiog National Park in Wales, and you can. So we run community action days. There's a farm shop, so you can kind of drop in and visit that. There's a land library you can drop in and visit. So there's quite a few different bits and pieces. They've also got campsites and other things, but yeah, the idea of the project from the outset in 2019 was that we would try and do nature restoration in a way that we weren't looking just at ecological recovery, but also cultural recovery. So we call it a biocultural restoration project. And recognizing that, I mean, that's one of the things that I think is very strange about our culture in lots of ways, having had the privilege of working overseas for a long time, is that we don't tend to have many spaces where people from different generations who aren't directly related to each other or in a formal educational space actually can meet, exchange knowledge, learn from one another. And our space is, because of the nature of the project, is we're focused on ecology, we're focused on nature, but we're also teasing out all those amazing connections to the arts, storytelling, sort of rural philosophy, and that kind of thing. So it's very special, and in some ways all of this stuff is like new but old, and maybe that's going to be, I've already think we've all said that in a different kind of way. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about restoring those threads between humans and nature, but at the same time we've lost lots of other threads, social threads between generations, and I don't know what it is, the breakdown of sort of churches or local pubs or whatever, but those spaces are few and far between now, so that's really interesting. Mark, it's slightly different what you're doing at Generation Wild. The sort of audience is a bit younger, etc., but what have you seen, not just from Generation Wild, but from other experiences at the centres that you've got, of the benefits that you've seen on the ground of people improving their relationship with nature?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some really profound changes in the young people that we work with, actually. I'd say the main thing that nature gives them is that real sense of calm and that chance to just slow down and reflect. So lots of them comment on that. I scribbled down a few quotes before I came on today, from some children that have taken part in our Generation Wild programme. And one of them said, it got my brain working, well, it keeps me calm on another level, distracting me from my worries. And another child said, it cleared my mind and made me forget the bad things. So really that sense of having that place where they can go and they can feel calm and they can kind of feel safe. And then much more than this for some of the children, it doesn't do this for all of them, but for a lot of these children it becomes a support mechanism for them. So we have an activity called Make Friends with a Tree, and you might know this activity, and lots of the people watching might know as well. It's a really simple activity. We get children in pairs. One child asks the other child to close their eyes. They guide them towards a tree, and they get them to really feel that tree, smell that tree, and really get to know that tree as well as they can. They then take them away from the tree, spin them round, and the idea is they open their eyes and they don't know which tree in the vicinity is theirs, so they've got to think back to what did that tree actually look like, what did it feel like, what did it smell like, and they go back and they try and find their tree. Really simple activity, takes just a couple of minutes, but for lots of the children that tree has become really important to them. It's kind of taken on special meaning for them, and it's somewhere where they actually go when they feel anxious or when they feel worried. And some of these quotes, they literally brought tears to my eye when I read them. There was one child said, it was cool since I have a friend that will never tell anyone my secrets. She doesn't talk, but she's always there in the same place. And then another child said, I felt like the tree was talking to me. It made me feel happy. It made me feel like I'm not alone anymore. And that's incredible, that just a simple activity with a tree can give that child that safe space. And I think they see nature as something that they can go into and they can almost interact with and even talk to without feeling judged in the same way they do by humans. So they can tell this tree their problems and things, and they can be open and honest with it and not feel like they're being judged. And it's that safe space, that place they can go to when they're feeling troubled. And I don't think we can underestimate the real power of nature in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just sad, isn't it, to sort of wonder if that's been missing from so many kids, and the potential
absolutely.
damage.
And there's also the growth in confidence, I think, as well. So we had one child, this was a story that came back from one of the teachers, and there was a girl who was selective mute. I think she was in year 3. She'd been in that school since reception class, and none of the teachers in that school had ever heard that girl speak. They started to do outdoor activities regularly each week, and the girl gradually developed confidence over the weeks. And it was in something like week 3 or 4 that child spoke for the very first time in school. And it went on from there. She developed massive confidence, and she developed to a person then that was sat at in the class actually putting her hand up and answering questions. And the teacher literally couldn't believe the change in this child, from this child that was, you know, so anxious that they couldn't even speak, to a child that had really bloomed and grown in confidence. And we also find the same with lots of children with behavioural difficulties. So we get the teacher saying, oh yeah, when they come on site, you're going to have to really watch out for this lad because he's got this really troubled background, you know, he could cause all sorts of problems. When they actually come on site and start interacting with nature, they're the ones that really take to it, and often they're the ones that become the leaders as well, and they're seen totally differently by their peers. And again, it can give children that real confidence in themselves, and I think that's really important as well.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and Hal. Yeah, that's great. It's really nice to get those perspectives, you know, on the ground, because the research doesn't tell the full story, but some of those are really, really powerful. And as you say, it is often a feeling of like, of course they feel better. You know. All right, we're sort of halfway through the podcast. I feel like we need a jingle or something. I don't have one, unfortunately, but let's pivot and talk specifically about this pathway. So each of these pathways, as a reminder, is a different way that's been found to help us improve that connection that we've now sort of all been discussing is so vital, so important. Because the good news is it can be improved, and you know, and contact, being there, touching it is a really big part of it. That emotional connection, having meaning, like the tree, for example, suddenly becoming a friend and someone that you can have a sort of individual relationship with. Lots of other things, but the compassion one in some ways is super obvious. It's like, yeah, by starting to notice how nature might need us, or the more than human world might need our help, and starting to take action, of course, it's going to become this cycle of care, you know, and we're going to care more, and then we'll probably do more. But I guess the question in some ways is how can we get people to care who just aren't even thinking about it? Because once you get them in, once you're on that spiral, if you like, you got them. But I don't know if anyone's got any sort of ideas or thoughts on how can we foster this care in the first place. I'm going to mix it up. Mark, you can go first, then I'll jump to Hal.
Yeah. To me, it all comes back to that direct contact again, I think. Because in the same way that you wouldn't expect somebody to love somebody that they've never met before, you need to have that direct interaction with something, I think, to develop that love for it. So I think it's really important. At our sites, we try to provide as many opportunities as we can for people to pick up creatures, as long as they do it gently, to hand feed the birds, for example. And hand feeding the birds is a really good example, because with AI restrictions, there have been times over the last few years where we haven't been able to do that at our sites, we haven't been able to offer it. And the people that come to our sites have really missed that. They've missed the direct contact that they have from that hand feeding. And other opportunities that people really enjoy are things like mini beast hunts and pond dipping. Any of those things where you get to actually have that direct hands-on contact with the creatures. And also we try to get people to put themselves into the mindset then of those creatures, and again I think that's really important. So when we're pond dipping and people are getting the creatures in their nets, we'd be saying to them, you know, how would you feel if you were that creature? Why should we be gentle when we're picking them up? So getting them to put themselves into the mindsets of those creatures can be a really powerful way of doing it.
Yeah.
And as I think you said earlier, a lot of people frown upon the anthropomorphizing of species, but actually it can be a really powerful way of getting people to connect and to really care about those animals.
That's actually, I wanted to ask Hal, is that something, this came up last week, we were talking about because it is frowned upon, anthropomorphism, but actually it's very common in other cultures. Is that something you found in your experience living and working with other people around the world?
Yes, in a way. I think there's actually a fine but very important distinction between anthropomorphization and personification, because if we're taking an ecocentric view, then a person could be a more than human person, whereas anthropo is, it immediately says, well, the way that you create that connection is to say, well, if it's like a human person, and in that sense we stay within our anthropocentric view, which is that only the human and that which we can convey humanity onto, which we will find it easier to do with like fluffy stereoscopic mammals rather than woodlice. Rather personification, if that category extends to other beings, can like allows them to be more themselves. So I think it's more common to find personification in other cultures where you would say like they just haven't drawn that line, they haven't done it, they don't have this barrier to overcome where they've separated themselves out, where it's like then I have to turn something into a little human to connect with it, because there's that sense of, you know, it's essentially an animistic perspective. So I think that finding those like ways of extending, like for us it's about how do we expand our circle of compassion again, and I would say doing that in a way where we make the best use of personification and story about that is definitely a really important and good way to go about it.
It's a really...
Because you said, Hal, sorry.
No, carry on.
I think as you said, Hal, earlier, it's that whether you feel part of nature or whether you feel separate from it that's really important. If you think that humans and nature are two completely separate things, then it's going to be much harder to develop that compassion for it, which I think you hinted at earlier. If, on the other hand, you see yourself as intrinsically part of nature and all the living things as your relations, then you're much more likely to care for them. And again, a big change for me was when I first started as a youngster to learn about evolution, because it made me realise that all the living creatures out there are literally my relations. So you've got to go back perhaps a few million years in the family tree rather than a few tens of years, but we are all intrinsically related. And if you realise that, that can make a big difference to how you then feel about the other creatures.
Yeah.
When we talk to children about evolution, for example, we will have a child. I remember a child that picked up a ladybird on their hand, and I said to that child, do you realise that ladybird's literally related to you? And we got into a conversation about evolution. And I think if you're looking at that ladybird from a perspective of that ladybird is actually literally one of my relations, then you've got much more chance of developing that loving relationship with it. So I think that's really important. And in terms of the language we use, I'm always really careful so that I try not, I always get into the trap of it myself, but I try not to talk about humans and nature. I try to talk about humans and the rest of nature, and rather than humans and animals, humans and other animals. So there's something in the language we use as well about whether people then feel part of it.
Absolutely, and it sort of feels subtle, but it's not. It's enormous, that difference. Yeah, it's it's funny, we can get to that feeling of feeling part of nature, connected to nature. You can get there through sort of facts. I remember thinking of very similar, studying biology and seeing that family tree and having that same sort of realization, but it's too much of a leap for a lot of people to get there through facts, which is why this idea of you say personification and sort of more than human personhood, and it's a very important distinction that you made there, Hal, as well, because it's this sense that we aren't making them more human, we're sort of understanding that we have something to learn from these other people, if you like, or persons. And stories, of course, are so sort of good at doing that. Is there anything else, Hal, that you've found that have helped to create that germ of compassion, other than sort of stories or thinking about personhood?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with Mark. It's funny looking at I think a lot of the other pathways ultimately help create compassion. So that's something to say straight up, and contact and proximity are definitely ones that we see in our work. Any opportunity to be up close with wild animals has a different feeling than, but even domesticated farm animals. We've taken young people lambing and to like handle like longhorn cattle and things like that, and that's always really powerful. But I would say, just to say something different, I think having positive role models who from a young person's perspective, but even from maybe we're all young in this because we've lost so much memory and practice. I think having people who you can see and respect, who can role model compassion for you and how to treat things, much like Mark's just described, talking to that young person about the ladybird and offering them another perspective. I think that's crucial, and that's a really powerful way, because it takes, we can see that perhaps turn to the dark side in our culture all the time around like what are people being influenced to do and value. Having people who have that genuine compassionate connection with nature and can share it in a compelling way is a very powerful thing, especially for young people who are kind of the doors wide open in their life, and they're trying to see like who do I want to be like, what do I want to do, and having good guides along the way. And we keep coming back around to story, but most stories, the old stories, you have these kind of guide characters or helper characters, magical helpers, who essentially play that role. And I think there's a reason they crop up in our stories all the time, because they are the portals to a new way of seeing and being in the world. So I think that they are very important for unlocking compassion in us, and ultimately I think they speak potentially to something deeper, which is a sense that the cultural values and stories and other things that we come up with aren't necessarily the ones in our culture. Like in others, it's about maintaining and continuing to value those things, which is a lot of the work that I was doing before, which is like revalorizing the knowledge of elders before they pass on and making sure that transmission of knowledge happens. But for us, it's perhaps more about building back, and that's where culture comes, like as you say, David, like the germ of culture is those individuals who perhaps never forgot or have gone through a lot of hard work to remember, and making sure that the gains that they've made are transmitted. Guides.
That's really, really interesting. And we have unfortunately lost a lot of that knowledge in the UK. Luckily, it does exist elsewhere in the rest of the world that we can still learn from. There's almost it sounds awful. We sort of lost a bit of respect for sort of elders in the UK, I think, a little bit. What can they teach us when they're seen as out of date and out of place with the modern world, when actually it's the modern world which is sort of lost its way, maybe. Mark,
that modelling you talked about, Hal, is really important, isn't it? I was thinking, it's no surprise if the first time a child sees a spider, if their parent goes, spider, picks up a shoe and kills it, it's no surprise that they then see that disconnect between humans and the rest of nature, and how they don't value those creatures because the parent's obviously not showing any value to that creature. So there's something in how we model that love and care for other creatures as well. And being careful how we talk about other creatures. So I think you said earlier how really easy to develop compassion for a polar bear or something warm and fluffy, but who develops compassion for the rats and the flies and the mosquitoes? And it's getting that sense that everything in nature is important, not just the cute fluffy things.
Mark, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Go on.
I know for a fact that you have been a bit of a role model yourself when you were a teacher, in perhaps helping others understand how important it is to be compassionate. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it was always, as a teacher, I always tried to help any wildlife that was in trouble on the premises. So I remember we had a woodpecker that was injured once, so I took the woodpecker in and I got the children to help me to get it into the box and to be calm around it and care for it, and then I took it down to the local wildlife hospital. And I got a bit of a name myself as a bit of a Dr. Dolittle in the area, and then all the children in the local area knew that I was the person that would take things to the wildlife hospital. So I'd have knocks on the door at all times of day and night saying, "Oh, Mr. Stead, I found this hedgehog or this rat or whatever it happens to be. Could you help us care for it and take it to the wildlife hospital?" And so I did that. And I think that stemmed in me from my own teacher, because the head teacher when I was a pupil at school did exactly the same thing. He was the sort of person that if we found a hedgehog in the school grounds that was suffering, he would take it in, look after it, take it to the local wildlife hospital. So yeah, there's definitely something really important into how we model those relationships between ourselves and other creatures with the young people.
Lovely. That feeds almost like this has been planned. That feeds really nicely actually to the final thing I wanted to talk about, and I must, because it's my job. And because it's great, sorry. But I should mention our campaign again. And each month we have sort of thrown out a different challenge, if you like, to people connected with that pathway. And this month, actually, it doesn't matter about months. We were going to invite people to keep doing this. thinking about compassion, this is a wonderful piece of art that we had created for us as well by an Indian artist called Sabu Kohli. He's done a separate one for each of the pathways, and this is compassion. And so we've set a challenge for each month, and actually we thought, let's celebrate those people that inspire us to be compassionate, because again, from what you've said and from the research as well, that is one of the ways that we, especially with young people, when they see someone, especially if that person is quite sort of aspirational, like people often talk about needing to make nature cool and stuff, and we don't need to make nature cool, it's already cool, but it does sort of help to have cool people, whatever that means, in those positions that are quite sort of people to want to aspire to be. But anyway, we've created this this challenge where we're getting people to nominate a sort of a local hero, someone that they are inspired by to be compassionate themselves. So please do visit our website, ReWild Yourself, and you can read various articles to find out more about the compassion pathways or the other pathways. We've got some sort of inspiration and ideas of activities that you can carry out related to these pathways. But yeah, so submit. We'd love to hear who your local hero is, and we're going to be sharing those online as well. So I would like you guys, if that's all right, to share with me. Hal, we'll start with you. Who someone has been like a hero to you and been that really important role model to show you how to be compassionate to nature?
Do they have to be alive?
No, there's no rules.
This is a dark question to begin with. I mean, on a personal, maybe I'll do the double again. I'd say
Yes.
on a personal level, my grandfather, who we knew as Bumps because he always banged his head. He was probably was my guide, and I think, like many good guides, a very quiet and unassuming person who, as Mark maybe described, just showed by doing. But at the moment, I think the shout out I'll give to someone who's around now and doing amazing things is we work with a lady called Mary Shuldham at Pempont, who looks after our tree nursery there, and we do amazing things with her, and she makes I think the main thing is that young people who we bring and meet Mary, it's not just that she has an immense knowledge of trees and processing seeds and growing and all of those kinds of things, it's that the young people can just see how much she loves it, like it radiates from her, and so I'd definitely nominate Mary. Maybe I will nominate Mary.
Yes, you must.
Yeah,
please do. Yeah, and thanks for sharing the reason. And that, I think that's a really good point as well, because sometimes when we do sort of hard work, the conservation work, the ecological work, it's a grind, and it can be quite sort of demoralizing and depressing, and sometimes we focus on that bit too much, but actually, like, remembering the joy in the resistance, the joy in that work that we can still have if possible, and that is what is more infectious, isn't it, than the doom. Thank you, Hal. That's great. Yeah, and please do nominate Mary. She sounds very deserving. Mark, same question to you. Is there anyone that you would nominate as your sort of local hero?
Yeah, you probably saw me smile when Hal said, do they have to still be alive? Because I've been really greedy and chosen 2 people, and neither of them are any longer with us. The first one is my Uncle John. So my Uncle John, he lived down in Devon, and he just had a really special relationship with the wildlife that lived around him, particularly in his garden. So he would always, every time I went to see him, he would always have a robin that was tame at that time. It was obviously not the same robin every time over the years, but he always had a robin that was tame. And the robin had got to know him, this particular one I'm thinking of, had got to know him so well that it knew the sound of his car.
Wow.
So he'd be out and he'd come back, and by the time he got on his drive, the robin would have heard the sound of his car, and it would be there sat on the windowsill, ready for the food that he knew Uncle John was about to give him. So I thought that was an amazing relationship, that he got that real connection with the bird, and I think the bird had a real connection with my uncle as well, that two-way thing. So that one was really special. And then the second person was actually the founder of WWT, where I now work, because this was one of the things that got me into conservation. My grandma knew Sir Peter Scott, the founder of WWT, and she used to take me down to Slimbridge when I was younger. On one particular occasion, she took me down with one of my best friends, Paul Huggins from primary school, and Sir Peter Scott was there, and he invited us into his house.
Wow.
Now, I'll never forget it, because he took us into his study where he used to do his paintings, and where they always used to film the BBC programmes. So they've got a massive open window there that you can look out onto the lakes and see the swans and the geese and things, and I think that's really stuck in my mind. And I had a chance to go and look back in there a few years ago. It's now been turned into a museum to him, and it brought back all those memories flooding back. But the reason it was really special to me was because he was obviously at that time a really important person and doing really well for himself, and I was, as far as I was concerned, just some rough little lad from a council estate. And the fact that someone like him had invited me into his house and wanted to share that love of nature with me just felt really powerful. It showed me that he really did feel that nature was for everybody, no matter who you were or where you came from. And I felt just so privileged that someone important would invite someone like me into there. It just made me feel really special inside.
That's really nice, Mark. Is that something that you've tried to remember as you've sort of become more important, or higher in positions, to have that sort of humility?
Absolutely. That's my entire passion, I think.
Yeah.
The thing that gets me out of bed in the morning and keeps me going is thinking of all those people that don't think nature's for them or don't think they're entitled to be there, and really trying to open it up and show that nature, and wetlands in particular in my case, are for absolutely everybody, and everybody's welcome there.
Yeah.
It's really important to me.
Absolutely. Okay, well, a reminder for the other people in sort of those positions of influence, and to keep your feet on the ground.
Absolutely. It's so important.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. What a lovely chat. I just want to give you both a chance to have a final say, whether that's if you want to sort of point people in the direction of where people can find out more, or it might just be a final tip or a book that you want people to read, or whatever it is, a sort of to leave our audience, whoever they may be, with a final sign-off. Hal?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I've got so much more that I'd like to speak to you both about, but I think maybe to sort of end with something that people could go to. I think one of the most powerful books I ever read, it's a very small book, which is very instructive. It's called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction by Ursula Le Guin. She's a science fiction writer, but very much was an engaged person in the world. And she calls on us doing this kind of work, whoever you are that's maybe trying to work along these pathways, to be the realists of a larger reality, because we've talked a lot about the individual level today, but there's so many structural barriers and things in the way of what we're trying to do. So I think constantly challenging ourselves to think about all of those factors and be those storytellers and realists of a larger reality is good, and just stick our foot in a rapidly closing door would be my parting shot, because it's all so important, and we've got a long way to come back from, that I think we need to retain we need to be radical.
Okay, I like it. Yeah, you're right, and it is good to focus on the positives and what we are doing, but we should never shy away from the scale and the urgency of the situation. And sometimes we do get caught up with sort of backpatting. So yeah, it's good. Be radical. I like it. Okay, Mark, same thing to you. Any sort of final words of wisdom that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so I won't be forgiven from an organisational perspective if I don't tell people to go to our website, which is wwt.org.uk.
Yeah.
Anyone that's interested in the Generation Wild programme in particular, that's got its own website, which is just generationwild.org.uk. But from a personal perspective, the one thing I would say to everybody is, if you want to read a book, read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, because it was an absolute game changer for me. Wow, it blew my mind. And it relates back to the stuff that Hal's been talking about, his experience, I think, because it's all about Indigenous perspectives. and how we can learn from those indigenous communities that see nature in a very, very different way to the way that we see it. They wouldn't dream of exploiting nature in the way that we do, just because they have that very, very different relationship with it. In some ways, even seeing it as sacred. So yeah, a real game changer for me. So if you want a book on nature connection, definitely Braiding Sweetgrass. I've recommended it with several people, both within WWT and within my friendship circle, and everyone comes back saying, wow, my mind was blown.
Well, I will make sure that we post both of those recommendations and anything else that you want to send to us on our website underneath, where we put this podcast out. Thank you again. As you said, Hal, there's so much more. As you said, we barely scratched the surface. As you say, we kept on the individual, and there's bigger cultural systemic, which makes me feel like we should do this again sometime. So if you're happy to come, we'll invite you back, and we can repeat this and carry on the conversation. But I think in the meantime, thank you so much. We'll see you at the next It's Time to Rewild Yourself podcast. Go out and go into some nature. Enough time on the screen. Let's all leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Thank you.
Thanks, David.